Coming up next, we're absolutely thrilled to be introducing to you another Nudgestock veteran, Professor Paul Dolan. He's an expert in happiness. He's written books, bestsellers Happiness by Design and Happily Ever After. He's the head of department, or as he's just been saying, a very, very, very bloody busy head of department for the LSE's Psychology and Behavioural Science department. He's here to talk about some interesting topics that might raise a few hairs. So thank you so much. It's my pleasure to introduce to the stage yet again, Professor Paul Dolan.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much, everybody, for being there. Yet again, I'm not sure I kind of like that really. Yet again to the stage. It's a really weird stage, isn't it? So I really hope there is an audience out there, and I hope some of what I say might prove insightful for you. I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about COVID-19. I'm sure you've not heard anything about that over the last 2 or 3 months. In response to COVID-19, we basically had two extreme positions that could have been adopted. One of which was to do nothing at all. And the other one is to lock everybody down until we find a vaccine. Now, as far as I'm aware, I don't know anybody who's thought that either of those extremes is a sensible policy solution. So necessarily then we're navigating our way through some quite significant trade-offs. And I think what I want to do in about 10 minutes or so today is to talk about some of those important trade-offs and also maybe ask the question of why we've not been able to talk so openly about them. I really should be clear that I don't think anybody can claim to know how best to respond to COVID-19. And of course, those trade-offs raise very difficult ethical challenges that no single perspective could ever claim to know how to best resolve. And so the pandemic, which is clearly not just a health pandemic, it's an economic and social one too, involves trade-offs across all aspects of human well-being and welfare. And so it's absolutely vital that the decisions are made by including experts from a range of different disciplines, from education, from mental health, from economics, palliative care, as well as epidemiologists and virus control experts. And I think that's why I think I've continually argued throughout, as many others have too, of course, this whole pandemic, is that we need different perspectives around the actual table to ultimately consider these various kinds of trade-offs. Because if we can't agree on the outcomes, we can at least ensure that the processes by which those outcomes come about ensure that every voice relevant is heard. So against that background, I want to consider two important trade-offs. They're important trade-offs. They're also close to my own intellectual heart as well. I want to first of all talk briefly about the trade-off between immediate mortality risks and lifetime inequalities. And then I want to talk about the trade-off between life expectancy and life experience. Now, I think we've known from a very early stage, from the cruise ships onwards, that younger people are at very, very low risk of adverse outcomes associated with COVID-19. Of the 40,000 or so deaths that we've had in the UK so far, less than 1%, so about 400 have been under the age of 40. There's been about 4,000 deaths in the time since 4,000 deaths of people under 40 in the time since COVID-19 first hit the UK, since we recorded our first death. So that's 400 of those 4,000 deaths have been due to COVID-19. So basically you have a very, very small risk of dying that has increased by a very small amount in the 10 weeks or so since 10 or 12 weeks now since the first death was recorded. So I think that's important, and it's interesting that hasn't been, to my mind, I think, featured so prominently in the discussions about the impact of COVID-19 when we've looked exclusively at mortality risks, really, but haven't paid as much attention as we might otherwise to who experiences those mortality risks. So everyone believes in fairness, everyone has a principle of equality, everyone believes in justice. The question is, equality of what? I think there's a powerful egalitarian principle, which you might call the fair innings argument, which is that everyone's entitled to some normal span of health, and anyone falling short of achieving that has in some sense been cheated. So that means that the more you fall short of the fair innings, the more you have been cheated. So as we kind of navigate our way through the various types and extents of lockdown and social distancing measures, which may continue for actually some time yet, right? It becomes ever more important that policymakers not only give us estimates of which of the population subgroups will die early, but how early. Because as I say, it appears quite striking to me that we haven't had as much of a conversation about the fair innings argument that essentially to die young is to have been cheated out of your lifetime. So in addition to that, I think I'm not going to spend any time on this. I'm actually conscious of time and want to get into a bit of a Q&A if I have time to. Since we're all going to die at some point, I mean, that's actually a fact of, I think that's one of the, we talk about death and taxes being the two certainties of life. I think it becomes really important that we have a conversation about the process of dying, not just when we die, but how. And I think that COVID-19 presents us as we move forward with an opportunity to have a much more open and frank conversation about that. I want to then just turn to the second of the trade-offs, which is the one between life experience and life expectancy. And I think it's pretty clear around the world that we've paid enormous amount of attention to mortality risks. We see daily updates of the number of deaths. You see comparisons being made across the world about who's had lower death rates, who's had higher ones. And that's important. Of course it's important. I mean, it'd be crazy for anyone to say otherwise. But since every policy decision is necessarily involving trade-offs, it's important that those deaths are placed in context. Even in the context of the number of people dying generally. I actually hadn't realised until March this year that about 1,600 people die every day in the UK anyway. And it's not impossible to conceive of a situation where policymakers present us with not just mortality risks and not just for whom and when, but actually the whole myriad of other consequences that are following from policy responses. So we know that the policy responses are affecting mental health, they're affecting employment, inequalities. In education is enormous. I mean, we're now starting to see some evidence suggesting that a decade's worth of inequality reduction is being offset in 6 months of kids not being at school. And it's interesting to me, at least in the very least, that we haven't had a fuller discussion of that, and how the consequences, particularly for children. I mean, that's why I draw attention to kids being off school, who have now been off school since mid-March, and there's no prospect of most of them returning at least until September, and maybe not even then in any kind of way that would be considered a conducive learning experience. I am fundamentally concerned about the impact that's having, not on just educational attainment and the inequalities in education, but on the social development of children. And it's interesting and quite puzzling to me that we haven't been able to have that at the forefront of the conversations about how to respond to COVID-19, whilst we have had a very clear exposition of the mortality risks and the number of people dying. So I wanted to, I think there's nothing that I've said in there that's controversial. So I guess the interesting question then is why there might be some controversy around talking about these kinds of trade-offs. And I think from a behavioural perspective, I think we as a society, as individuals, as people having conversations, find it easier to deal in absolutes. It's much easier when you don't have to talk about opportunity costs and trade-offs, which is the mantra of econ. You can talk about things really fundamentally mattering, and it enables you, I think, to signal how much you care. It enables you to make statements of, following the science and being very much concerned about mortality risks. It enables you to signal how much mortality risks matter to you. It also makes you more likable, I think, if you start thinking in terms of trade-offs and opportunity costs, then you're kind of, I don't know, just somehow not as decent or a nicer person as if you signal how much you care about these really fundamental attributes of life and death. I think it's also simpler. It's so much easier to deal in absolutes, and in Happy Ever After, which Dan kindly mentioned at the introduction to my talk, I talk about positive harms that might come, possible harms that might come from social narratives, from rules about how we should live, rules of thought and action that help make a complicated world easier for us and help us make sense of that world. And if we look to these narratives for clues about how to live, then we're given a coherent path to follow. Not only does it give us a coherent path to follow, it also gives us a coherent path by which to judge other people. So when people question narratives, then we can help them. We can look scornfully at them, and we can, sort of judge them quite harshly, individually and also at a social level. So in Happy Ever After, I talk about 9 narratives, and one of those is in fact health. And here's the idea that you have a responsibility to not only maximize your own health, but also to maximize the health of the people who you're acting on behalf of. And I think that the responses to COVID-19, I think for me at least, have shown just how powerful that narrative is. Of course, I wrote Happy Ever After long before anyone knew we were going to be experiencing a pandemic. But it draws attention to how much we value life expectancy over life experience, and it kind of drives the demands for stringent measures. It also makes people like me nervous about saying whether some of those policy responses weren't in fact social welfare enhancing when we consider all of the other myriads of impacts that those policy responses have had. So I think, again, it's not a controversial thing to say, but of course the preservation of life matters, but it's also important that we don't forget that we have to live life too. So I think I'm going to conclude now. I think that was I said I'd take about 10 or 12 minutes to say what I wanted to. I think that's as far as I'd like to get to, Rory, and maybe you've got some things you might like to pick up on.
Well, this strikes me as incredibly interesting because there seem to be areas of discussion where any kind of utilitarian approach is viewed with visceral horror. And I often quite enjoy experimenting with policy positions or opinions which are perfectly easy to justify, but which everybody else finds repugnant. So one of the things I often say is, I prefer my daughters took up smoking to taking up cycling in London. And basically everybody vomits a little bit into their mouth. And my argument is, look, if they die at 68, it's a bummer, but if they die at 23, it's a complete tragedy. There are other interesting things why, so people who engage in, for example, drug taking, which is a health risk, are absolutely excoriated, whereas people who climb Everest are treated like heroes, okay? Whereas they're both, actually, the Everest climbing is more dangerous, undoubtedly, okay? And then the third one, I suppose, would be occasionally, just to scandalize people, say that the NHS is a monstrous redistribution of wealth from the young to the old. Which, if you think about it, is, essentially people like Dan, who are paid less than me and have less wealth than me, are essentially funding, the healthcare of an old fat bloke like me in 10 years' time. And yet, when you say these things, which are kind of objectively true, essentially you feel, okay, this argument ain't going to go anywhere. There's an additional one, by the way. You could make the point that there are 3 things. There's expectation of future life years, which declines when you get older. There's the fact that if you've made it to 83, you've kind of lucked out anyway, because you've had 83 years of high quality life. There's a third factor, which is that if you think about it, if you're a parent and you die in your 50s and you have children who are 12, that is, in second order effects, inordinately more of a tragedy than if you die when your kids are 25. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so they're quite. So I was on a longevity group, and what I couldn't understand.
I can't retain everything. All
Sorry.
You're saying.
Okay, I'll pass over to you.
So let me try and deal with at least 2 or 3 of the points you made. So I want to be clear about the fair innings, what the ethical principle that sits underneath it is. It is true that you may wish to give greater priority to younger people over older people because the younger people have more to gain. So that would be a utilitarian argument. So a 40-year-old dying has lost about 42 years of life expectancy. An 80-year-old dying has lost about 9. But the fair innings argument is a retrospective accounting for what you've already had and not even what you're about to get. So if you were to imagine a choice between a 40-year-old who would live for another 9 years and an 80-year-old who would live for another 9 years, the utilitarian calculus would say that they should get equal value. The prioritarian calculus of the fair innings would say that you would treat the younger person over the older one because the older one has had more. And I think that's part of what, when I've done social preference work in this area, which I did in an earlier life as a health economist, that social preference is actually felt very strongly by most people, and especially older people. It's actually often the older people that will talk about the fair innings. As I say, citizen preferences in calmer, colder states suggest the prioritarianism for younger over older people. Let me then deal with the second point, I think, which you said about risk-taking in relation to taking drugs or climbing mountains. And I completely agree with you. I mean, I think there's nothing. I mean, what ought we to judge the impact of our actions on? Well, on our own well-being and on the well-being of those affected by our decisions. And so, substantively, you would want to look at the full flow of impact from climbing mountains compared to taking drugs. And it's entirely plausible that that climbing Everest is much more harmful for individuals and for social welfare. But it might not be. And I think maybe one of the reasons why we might have this moral judgment is not always bad, is that actually, by and large, people that may have gone out and explored and taken risks in ways such as that would be like climbing Everest would be doing something that was better for society in the long term than those who took heroin and so on. So it might be that some of the moral judgments, which we would want to cleanse some of our choices on the basis of, actually contain something substantively that actually contains something substantively rational in them.
I think there is something interesting there. There's a great book, The Elephant in the Brain, by Kevin Simler and Robin Hanson. And some of the root of this must lie in evolutionary psychology, I think.
Yeah.
Because we have very, very strong instincts, not only to care for the sick, but to actively intervene. What is interesting is I was on a sort of longevity commission. Now, if you'd been on a commission about poverty, it would have been axiomatic that the first people to look at are the very, very poor. Okay. You don't worry about someone who's, generally you worry about that more than you worry about someone who's, unable to pay for the second jacuzzi, as it were. And yet one of the strange things about the Longevity Commission is it didn't really say, before we do anything else, we should look at the causes of really premature death.
Yeah.
And focus on those. And of course, what's interesting about it is that depending on your life stage, what you need to focus on is very different. I mean, actually, between the ages of 20 and 40, mental health is probably the greatest risk to you. Suicide. Nassim Taleb always argued, don't smoke and don't travel in helicopters, is about the most relevant advice. And yet the health advice that's being given to the young is really health advice that's appropriate or far more pertinent to the old.
Yeah, but also I think this is why I think the perspective taking is really important. So it's not just perspectives of different groups and different characteristics, but actually it probably also means different ages. I mean, if you think about most of the policy makers, I would imagine that most of the decisions are being made by people in their 50s, probably, who it's probably a time when you might be most fearful of death. And so it's kind of interesting that it's just, I think it's an important procedural point that we incorporate different perspectives in the decision-making process, which will include views of younger and older people. I mean, I think it's really important that a lot of these conversations as we move out of lockdown and what we do about lockdown measures include conversations with older people. We need to find out. I think there's often a judgment that's made about, or an expectation that's made about other people, about how either what they do think or what they ought to think. And I think that's why narratives are so important, is that not only do we make assumptions about what other people think, we think we know what they ought to, even if they don't.
And interesting about the narrative about relative age, so that one of the most extraordinary behavioral sort of biases really over the last 20 years was the presentation of rising property prices as a good news story. And that suggested that, in a sense, the news media were dominated by people aged 50 plus, and economics as a profession is dominated by people aged 50 plus who already own a home. To anybody under 40, the same thing was a catastrophe, not a good news story.
And it's why it's also why I'm just so I just want to keep mentioning the kids thing, because we've got lots of uncertainty about virus transmission rates. We've got lots of uncertainty about lots of things moving forward. One thing we can be pretty certain of is that around 700,000 children are at home where school for those 700,000 children is the best place for them to be, the safest place for them to be, the place they get most attention, the place they get cared for, the place they get nourished and fed. It just feels, there's something wrong with where we've got to when the priorities of the children have been so neglected.
I think that's really, I've got a great question here from Aidan Watts, which is relevant to your good innings point, which is, has our frame of reference of a good innings become too optimistic?
Yeah, it's a super question. I don't know. I think we're almost to the point at which, I mean, one of the things that COVID-19 may have done is given us a sort of wake-up call, a sense of the mortality that we face. That actually, there are things that are beyond our control sometimes. I mean, of course, you can think about ways in which we can control it, but I mean, there are things that come along that knock us off this path to living forever. I think that maybe we've sort of got this idea, and as you see people in the very, very affluent who are engaging in all sorts of activities to try to prolong their lives to 150 or something, that we kind of may have lost sight of the fact that we should be more accepting of the fact that we're going to die, which is why I think that the process of dying becomes so important. That we are quite rightly fearful of the manner in which we die, and COVID-19, from what I can tell, is a really awful death, and so it's that really that for me would be where we should be paying much more attention to, is kind of the way in which we die, and not just when we die.
And one great question from Anonymous as well is the very act of talking trade-offs, and a fascinating thing. I completely failed to notice the idea that the very phrase herd immunity would cause a scandal. And that's, of course, because I was familiar with the phrase and I knew that was the standard phrase used. Whereas to people who've never encountered it before, the use of the word herd just seemed like anathema. And this great question, I think, from Anonymous here, which is, when we talk about trade-offs, are we basically violating this care, harm, moral foundation because the very idea of talking about a trade-off makes you look like a calculating bastard?
That's absolutely correct. I think that's right. That person is absolutely spot on. I think that you set yourself up for being someone who, I don't know, in some way doesn't care, because if you kind of present things in absolutes, you're signaling very clearly that this is important. And I think there is some sense in which we do judge people less well if they're willing to engage in the more complex, complicated discussion of opportunity costs and trade-offs.
I always remember the politician John Redwood, who is considered a Vulcan. And the fascinating thing with him, he's a former McKinsey consultant, I think. And if you put him in front of an audience of economists, he was basically the most intelligent person in the world. But if you put him in front of the public, he came across as this weird, depersonalized calculating machine. And in politics, of course, the blend of logos and pathos has massively shifted, I think, in terms of pathos, which kind of bothers me a bit. I'm terribly sorry to wrap there, but congratulations, I think, Anonymous, for spotting something absolutely critical. We're now going to move into a kind of video role, but Paul, thank you enormously. That was absolutely fantastic.
Rory, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being here.
Always a joy. And if you're thinking of climbing Everest, consider maybe drugs instead. Okay, thanks.